familiar, friendly faces, thank you for coming out this evening. I hope we can make it worthwhile for you. I'm not going to speak at length because I want to leave plenty of time for question and answer. I know many of you here know quite a lot about the Syria situation. I'd like to hear your views as well and exchange ideas with you. I'm going to meander about a bit, forgive me, but this mirrors the situation in Syria itself. It's very fluid. And what's just happened, the tremendous shock of the collapse of the Assad government, has left many of us, former supporters of the Assad government, also in a state of shock and disarray, bewilderment and confusion. So this is going to be a bit of a stream of consciousness from me as I try to feel my way towards an understanding of what's just happened and why it happened, how it's happening, and what's going to happen next. One tool that can help us to understand, I think, is vocabulary, and to look for some of the key words in the developing Western narrative about Syria. For example, we are told that the new rulers in Damascus, they're not described as a regime. In the days of Assad, it was always the Assad regime, when in fact they were a legitimate government, legally, politically, commonsensically, and yet they were always called a regime. But these jihadis who just come to power, ex-ISIS, ex-Al-Qaeda, arrived toting guns, they are not a regime. They are politely referred to as the interim government or caretaker government. More accurately, they might be called a junta. They are a bunch of guerrilla leaders, military men, who have no legitimacy other than the guns behind them. They're not an interim government, but they're well on the way to becoming one. They do have a problem, and the West has a problem because of their jihadi past and the fact that HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the leading group here, is a designated terrorist group, designated by the United States and the UK and the UN. And presentationally, this is a bit of a problem. It's not stopping Western leaders trooping to Damascus to kiss the feet of the new Sultan of Damascus, but it is a bit awkward, not least for legal reasons. Some governments might actually be called to account by judges if they get too close to these officially designated terrorists. Never mind, a solution is at hand. And the leader of the terrorists announced recently that all the jihadi movements were going to dissolve themselves. There'll be no more HTS or any of the other myriad acronyms, the different jihadi groups. They will exist no more. That solves the problem at a stroke. There will be no more illegality because these groups will no longer exist. problem solved, or at least that one problem. The jihadis will still have a major problem because they're not very organized among themselves. HTF appear to be in control, but the reality on the ground suggests otherwise. They are struggling. One thing I only realized quite recently is that HTS are very thin on the ground. Across the large country of Syria, they can probably only muster about 30,000 armed men. And no women, I'm being accurate here. The jihadi army doesn't admit women, although the Kurds do, but they're not jihadis. The HTS are thin on the ground, and although the central authority would like to impose discipline, they're just not able, and therefore we're seeing atrocities. The Western media, who rushed to Damascus in the early days, disappeared very quickly, and so they've not been around to report on some of the fruits of the revolution, of the pogroms taking place in Alawite areas in particular. During the conflict, the slogan of the jihadis was Christians to Beirut, Alawites to the grave. And that is the approach they're now following, now that they have a free hand. They're ethnically cleansing, they are exterminating Alawites wherever they get chance. But the Alawites, unlike most of the Christians, are fighting back. And this brings me to the next key word, remnants, or Assad remnants. You may notice, if you follow the Western media closely, that they don't talk much about the Alawites. Any resistance is attributed to Assad remnants. Well, this is wrong in at least two ways. Hardly anybody now still supports Assad. Assad left a lot of bitterness behind him. We can go into the rights and wrongs of this. Maybe he didn't have much choice. But the fact is that he left a lot of bitterness by the way he scuttled and by other things that went on in those final days. So those people who are fighting for their lives and their families. They're not fighting for Assad. Nobody's dreaming about resurrecting the Assad regime. The Alawites in particular face a real genocide, and nobody talks about it. A few people speak about the Christians. I have myself been involved with some members of the House of Lords getting up petitions and asking questions in Parliament. But there's nobody who speaks up for the Alawites. They are friendless. They have no external supporters. At least the Christians do have people in the outer world speaking up for them, but the Alawites have no one. Even the Shia, who are also in the front line of the jihadis, the Syrian Shia at least have an element of support from Iran and people to draw attention to their predicament, but the Alawites have no one, and therefore what's happening is the jihadi gunmen are parading through Alawite areas, brandishing their ISIS flags and their al-Qaeda flags, looting, intimidating, and summarily executing Alawites, particularly young men who may or may not have been soldiers in the Syrian Arab army. But you wouldn't know this, of course, from the Western media that were so vigilant about the alleged abuses during the Assad era when human rights was the watchword. Why aren't we hearing about human rights now? It's just inconvenient, of course, for the developing narrative. Another key word is presence, as in the US presence in Syria. It is not occupation. Whatever you do, don't call it an occupation, even though the presence of a couple of thousand foreign troops without permission on your territory is occupation. That's the legal and commonsensical definition of it. But no, those US forces are there as a benign presence. Trump blurted out a few years ago that they were there to grab the oil. At least that was being honest. But there's a new developing narrative now. Literally today, Trump's nominee for Secretary of State, little Mario Rubio, said at a Congress hearing that, well, maybe we should think about leaving those troops in Syria so they can deal with ISIS. Huh. That's interesting. Whatever happened to ISIS? Well, books have been written about it, one of them here. But this is the excuse now being brandished to justify the continued presence of those US forces. Now, for at least a decade, the real purpose of those forces has been to prevent the Assad government benefiting from Syria's oil. Most of Syria's oil and gas and grain was in areas of the northeast, partly Kurdish areas, where the Americans installed themselves on the pretext that they were fighting ISIS along with their Kurdish puppet militia. But the real purpose was to prevent the Syrian government getting its hands on income from oil and gas, which represented in the old days 20% of Syria's GDP. Now that is a big chunk of any country, and it's no surprise that the Syrian economy has faltered over these long years, and why they haven't had electricity, deprived of their main source of energy. Another key word is intervention, as in the Turks have intervened in northern Syria. Again, not invaded, though that is the correct word, but they are staging an intervention. Now, this is something we in the Western media are a bit confused about. We haven't quite worked out whether the Turks are good guys or bad guys. Because on the one hand, it was good that they got rid of Assad, and on the other hand, it's not good that they're going to bash our friends and our puppets, the Kurds. So we're a bit confused about how to talk about Turkey. Nevertheless, nobody speaks about the Turkish invasion, although that is what is really going on. And the jihadi militia, which are operating up there in the far north, the main one is called Syrian National Army, which is a triple misnomer. It's not Syrian, it's Turkish, it's not national, it's local. and it's not an army, it's a militia. The Syrian National Army and its often Turkish soldiers in Syrian uniforms are poised to invade the Kurdish areas and take back control of the oil. So it looks like the Americans will hang around at least for some months. There must be a question mark over what Trump will actually decide to do about that US presence. In the past, in his previous incarnation as president, he tried twice to withdraw those forces, but he was thwarted by the US deep state. Will he return to the charge? And I just observe in passing that everything that happens in Washington at the moment, we have to bear in mind that it might be tactical. Trump's priority at the moment is to get his nominees through these congressional approval procedures. So they may say things that won't be carried through later on. And we may actually see a slightly different Trump emerge once he no longer needs to get his nominees, like the controversial Tulsi Gabbard, through these tedious proceedings. We have to wait and see on that. But I have hopes of the Orange Man. I must say, I don't suffer from Trump derangement syndrome. He's disappointed us. He's obviously too pro-Israeli, but you never know with a narcissist, an autocrat, an imperious personality. I suspect that he's not the Israelis' dream candidate for President of the United States. I suspect, in fact, that he is their nightmare. A strong character who famously doesn't get on with Netanyahu personally, who doesn't brook dissent, who doesn't pussyfoot around, who, when Netanyahu says, "No, you can't come and see me, it's the Jewish Sabbath," a man who gets his envoy to say, "Bugger that, I'm coming." And Netanyahu makes himself available. A US president also who is not angling for re-election, who's therefore free in that way, and who doesn't need funding by the lobby. This is the ultimate Israeli nightmare, I'd have thought. We may be bitterly disappointed, but I have to say that the shadow cast forward by the Gaza agreement and the way it's obviously only happened because of Trump gives me some grounds for hope. Moving on through these key words, as I said, we mustn't talk about invasion. So when the Israelis invade the Golan, they are making advances. It's more polite. Advances. Swift advances, because they're totally unopposed, of course. The Israelis may come to regret these swift advances. They may, well, it's for discussion whether they are doing it deliberately in order to store up further grounds for conflict with the new regime in Damascus, And just earlier today, there was an incident on the Golan. The Israelis killed 3 of the new regime's forces. If they wanted to set up problems for the future with the new regime, they're going about it the right way. Now, the new regime has been making cooing noises to Israel, saying to Western audiences and to Israel itself, look, we're not like the previous regime, we're not interested in the Palestinians. You Israelis have helped us, you gave us the nice uniforms that we're all wearing, we love you. But the Israelis will not take yes for an answer. They still say, we don't trust you. We don't trust Syria. One day Syria may be strong again, so we're going to keep you weak. And we're going to mobilize our people in the Western media to write articles arguing against the lifting of sanctions. Sanctions, this is the key word now about Syria. It has been the key word for a decade because the collapse of the regime happened because of sanctions. Western sanctions were the heaviest applied to any country on the planet, and they were applied over more than a decade. It was virtually impossible to import anything into Syria except through smuggling, which led to corruption, which was blamed on Assad, of course. It made it extremely hard to make power stations operate, so people were only getting at best a couple of hours of electricity a day. Who got blamed? Assad, of course. People couldn't look beyond their daily suffering after such an extended period, and they blamed Assad rather than the Western powers who were implementing those sanctions. But now the key question going forward is, will the sanctions be lifted for Mr. Julani? What an unfortunate warrior name to have if Israel is just occupying the Julan, the Golan. No wonder he changed his name back to his real family name of Ashara. So the man who was formerly Mr. Golan is now in a bind. How is he going to get sanctions lifted so he doesn't meet the same fate as Assad? Because that's what will happen if he and his henchmen don't deliver more electricity, more imports, more of a normal life. He'll get blamed. And so there's a battle royal going on in the background over the lifting of sanctions, with the Israeli lobby and some of their outriders arguing to maintain the sanctions, and the Western deep state wanting to see sanctions lifted so that the new Syria can become a fully fledged member of their gang. After all, they cover every other base in the Middle East, with the exception of Iran and Yemen, but all the Arab states, they've got the full Meccano set. The Americans control every other Arab country. Syria was the last man standing. This was why it had to be taken down. Syria, I was told before I ever became ambassador to Syria, before I went, I was told Syria is the beating heart of the Arab world. And it was true, and that's why the heart had to be stopped. The Arab world is nothing now, just a cultural entity in the 1970s, we were running scared of the Arab League. We knew who the head of the Arab League was. And for years, nobody gives a fig for what the Arab League does. And no Arab country stands up in any meaningful way for the emblematic cause of Arabism, Palestine. Only Syria stood up, and it therefore had to be taken down, and taken down it has been. Just staying on sanctions, there's another phrase that kept coming up over the years: humanitarian exemptions. We were told by the British government repeatedly, when we managed to question them, put down questions in Parliament by friendly MPs, don't worry about sanctions because there are humanitarian exemptions. It's not true that the people of Syria are suffering, it's only the regime. But now we suddenly discover that nobody talks about the humanitarian exemptions anymore. It's the sanctions must be lifted. It's accepted now, it's common knowledge now that the sanctions have been dreadful for the people of Syria, as indeed they have. But the same people who are now clamoring for the lifting of sanctions were the ones who told us that no, sanctions don't matter, it's all taken care of by the humanitarian exemptions. Hypocrites, liars, evil people. And therefore, personally, I find it confusing whether I'm for or against the lifting of sanctions now. Everybody, I think, would want the Syrian people not to suffer, but it will be ironic indeed that we reward the jihadis and their supporters by lifting sanctions now that they've managed to remove the government that was standing for Palestine and against America. The other phrase we're not hearing, but which we were hearing all the time, was human rights abuses. This was the litany throughout the Assad years. There was a whole industry devoted to investigating the abuses by Assad. And this has an afterlife now. It's been revived. We're hearing about those graves that are being unearthed, and a rather unlikely figure of over 100,000 people in one mass grave. How did they count them? But we're not hearing about the human rights abuses in the context of what is actually happening today in Syria, in those Alawite villages, Christian villages, in fact all over the country. In a milder way, just this week, the religious police started to operate in Damascus, as they've already been operating in Riyadh and other Gulf cities for years. It's ironic that Saudi Arabia should actually be moving in the liberal direction, just as Syria is moving in the fundamentalist direction. But if you go to Damascus today, be careful, ladies, to cover up. And you'll be pleased to know that little schoolgirls must also wear the hijab now in Syria. But we're not hearing about this from the feminists in The Guardian or wherever, because it's inconvenient. It was only inconvenient when it was the evil Assad and his evil backers in Russia and Iran could be held responsible. So what we have today now, if the abuses are mentioned at all in the Western media, it's put down to indiscipline. Just isolated incidents, bit of indiscipline, somebody out there didn't get the memo. Guys, pay attention. We've got to pull the wool over these Western fools' eyes, make like we're moderates. They'll go away after a bit. Just let us get sanctions lifted, yeah? Cool it for a bit, then we can go back to doing what we love doing, which is victimizing people who are not Sunnis, who are not fundamentalists like us, people who are secular. God preserve us. That's what we want to get back to, but just for the moment, tactically, cool it. But not everybody's getting the memo. Now, don't think here I'm going to go off on a tangent, but the next word is grooming. I'm not going to talk about Rochdale or Bradford or Rotherham, but grooming. This is what has happened to al-Qaeda. This is what we're witnessing. Al-Qaeda, those firebrands, have been groomed by the West, particularly in the years since they got control of Idlib province and they set up Jihadi Central there. They have been groomed, not least by British specialists in information and warfare, how to pull the wool over the eyes of Western liberal audiences, and how to make up stories, for example, about chemical weapons and human rights abuses, and how to portray themselves as being moderate. Well, Al-Qaeda have been groomed. You could, if you were perverse, make an argument that the grooming has been in the other direction, and it's Al-Qaeda who groomed the West into accepting them. Because after all, Al-Qaeda have got their way. The clue was in the name, ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. That was always their agenda. Not the Islamic State of America and Britain, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And now they've got control of Syria. That was always their main agenda. There are books to be written about this. Some of them have already been written. What lay behind Al-Qaeda, what were they really about, what was ISIS really about? Well, we have to look at the Syrian situation for what it is and realize that Al-Qaeda have moved on. They've been groomed, but they've groomed us back, and they are now sitting there in control of the key Arab capital of Damascus and getting more or less our full support. So who's been grooming who? And who won the war on terrorism? I don't think it was Al-Qaeda who lost. It wasn't ISIS, who is still allegedly going strong. In fact, there never really was a war. There was a war on Syria. There was a war on Syria. The presence of ISIS was used as a pretext for Western forces to bomb Syria and go and occupy a key part of Syria and bring down the secular regime of Assad. And ISIS was only ever a pretext. I mean, what has ISIS ever done of any strategic military significance outside the theaters of Iraq and Syria? Isolated incidents, a few kidnappings, a few beheadings, but militarily significant, and yet we were calling them a threat to Western civilization. ISIS have been used and abused. but they're now transmogrified into the man formerly known as Mr. Golan. They've now reached the peak. Finally, with regard to this vocabulary thing, pornography. Again, don't think you've strayed into the wrong meeting, but that's my word actually for Assad porn. I mean, don't you just love it, hearing about all these mass graves and torture and Said Naya? You can't get enough of it. That's what the media seem to think. They certainly can't get enough of it. And there are now missions going from the United Nations, who were strangely quiet for a decade. Now they're suddenly very anxious to go and investigate and make sure that evidence isn't lost, custody of evidence. So now there's a whole industry developing around Assad porn. And if you have the misfortune to monitor the Daily Mail, as I often do, in the interest of work, you consume a lot of Assad porn, and the Guardian, obviously. To conclude, let's deal with the question of how and why it happened. I mean, it does take some explanation why the Syrian army collapsed as it did. And I confess I'm still groping towards an understanding. Facts are only trickling out. But the root cause was that the Syrian army wasn't combat ready. After they pushed the jihadis back into Idlib 4 or 5 years ago, they were gradually stood down. Elite units were disbanded. Young men were allowed to go back and join their families where they were needed because of the poverty. They couldn't be kept in the army indefinitely. The Syrian army is a conscript army. The Syrian army suffered in the same way that any ordinary Syrians did from the shortages, not having electricity, power, diesel, and not being able to tap, unlike the jihadis, unlimited funds. The jihadis had behind them the Qatar with its bottomless pockets, paying their salaries and paying the Turks to provide the latest equipment, the Israelis providing uniforms. The Syrians, on the other hand, were impoverished, and that includes the army, which also had terrible morale problems because of not just the poverty, but also the pounding by the Israeli Air Force. Over the last 3-4 years, there's not a week gone by without the Israelis pounding Syria. The Syrian air defenses, it turned out, were quite effective, as we discovered from the fact that when they got chance, the Israelis made sure that they were smashed to smithereens. And now the Syrian army is no more, and whatever new army emerges will have virtually nothing in the way of modern weaponry. So basically, what happened was the army collapsed from inside. There were more proximate causes in those fateful days. Actually, what happened was a surprise, and yet it had been predicted. The Russian think tank, which back in October published an incredibly perceptive article foreseeing more or less exactly how it would happen. And the Russians knew it was coming. They had their tensions with Assad, who seems to have been a bit complacent. Some people argue that the Russians could have saved the Syrian government, that they betrayed Assad in the end. I find that hard to credit. I don't see what they had to gain, because the loss of Syria has obviously been a great strategic loss of prestige to Russia. Iran has lost more. Iran did what it could, which was limited. Iran had been beaten up itself by Israel and America. There wasn't much that Iran could do. But certainly in those fateful days around December 8th, I think it was, bad things happened. Some Syrian units refused to fight. Others were ordered by the chief of staff, acting apparently on Russian advice. Some units were ordered to surrender. Other units were ready to fight. There could have been a battle on the outskirts of Hama, but some people were stabbed in the back. One day the truth will come out and it will all be fascinating on the anecdotal level. But in terms of understanding what went on, it was sanctions, sanctions, sanctions. That is the one key reason why it all happened, and why going forward, that is also the key issue. And finally, looking forward, will it last? Will the jihadi regime take root? Will Syria be broken up? Some people whose opinion I respect say that that is the plan, that Syria will be broken up. There'll be a coastal area, mainly Alawite. Israel will grab even more land next to the Golan. The Turks will take control of the north. The Americans are already there in the northeast. And there'll just be a rump Sunni state around Damascus, and possibly Aleppo.